She said his dirty clothing hung from his emaciated frame in tatters. His skin was sallow, bruised, and broken. His eyes were filmed and crusted. I wept, she said, at the sight of his suffering. He had let the devil enter his heart, and the evil had ruined his life like a cancer to his soul. He was now the victim of his victims, destined to live a life of torment and regret. He was sobbing. I could feel his shame. He looked up at me for only a moment, she said, but our eyes met. I reached out, touched his hands lightly, and quietly said what I'd come to say. I forgive you. I forgive you is what she could say to the man who brutalized her mother and brother and countless others, and who wanted to inflict the same injustice on her. And if people who have endured the trauma and the injustice of the Rwandan genocide can build a society now that is going to work through what happened and find reconciliation and healing, I would argue that our culture too, when it comes to abortion, can also find reconciliation and healing. So on that note, I'm going to play this video for just a few moments and then carry on. Supporter Naomi Wolf has made the following remark about pro-lifers' use of graphic images, such as the ones that I just used. She says the pro-choice movement often treats with contempt the pro-lifers' practice of holding up to our faces their disturbing graphics. But how can we charge that it is vile and repulsive for pro-lifers to brandish vile and repulsive images if the images are real? To insist that the truth is in poor taste is the very height of hypocrisy. Besides, if these images are often the facts of the matter, and if we then claim it is offensive for pro-choice women to be confronted by them, then we are making the judgment that women are too inherently weak to face a truth about which they have to make a brave decision. This view of women is unworthy of feminism. End quote. Since we know now that we are dealing of the unborn. And since it's very clear that abortion is an act of violence which kills those people, what I'd now like to do is move on to the portion of my presentation where I look at the parallels between abortion and historical atrocities such as the Holocaust. And I'd like to preface those remarks by saying some people say that not just abortion shouldn't be compared to the Holocaust, but nothing should be compared to the Holocaust because the Holocaust is a unique event that should be looked at on its own. And in response to that, I would like to say, first of all, let's consider what those who create memorials about the Holocaust do. Do they look at it in isolation, or do they look at it in a broader context? Well, several years ago, I visited the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. And amidst remembering the Jewish Holocaust, they have a whole exhibit dedicated to more present-day genocides and atrocities. And at one point in this other exhibit, they had images from 1994's Rwandan genocide. And next to those images, they had a quote by Holocaust survivor Elie Wiesel, who said, "A memorial unresponsive to the future would violate the memory of the past." A memorial unresponsive to the future would violate the memory of the past. Indeed, the concept of comparing past and present atrocities is not new. Consider this next example. A Foreign Service officer posted in the United States Embassy in Bangkok by the name of Charles Twining during the time of the Cambodian genocide was constantly receiving the stories of people who had lived through the Cambodian genocide, and they were telling him the countless atrocities going on. And as he was hearing the horrific details of what was happening to these innocent human beings, he said, quote, "My mind needed some way of framing the thing, and the Holocaust was the closest thing I had." This sounded to me, he said, like extermination. You wipe out a whole class of people, anyone with glasses, anyone with a high school education, anyone who was Buddhist. I mean, he said, the link was natural. Another example of the comparison of other atrocities to the Holocaust is with the Bosnian genocide. In the early 1990s, there was a reporter for The Guardian by the name of Ed Vuliani, who was stationed in Bosnia to report what was going on, and in particular, it was he and two other reporters who broke the news of the atrocities going on, specifically in the death camps. And as the images that they obtained were circulated to the public, people were instantly making the connection between what was happening in Bosnia and what had happened historically in the concentration camps. And interestingly, Vuliani, this reporter, was frustrated by the linkages which were being made. And he said, "I had to spend as much time saying this isn't Auschwitz as I did saying, but this is still unacceptably awful." Interesting, several years after these parallels were being made, and this was in the news, this reporter, Vuliani, met with the director of the Holocaust Memorial Museum, Walter Wright. And Vuliani asked Wright if he thought the phrase, "echoes of the Holocaust," was appropriate for what was going on in Bosnia. And Wright replied, "Yes, very